I want to welcome Dr. Matt Lundeberg, who is here today to talk to us about his specialization. And I want to actually just hand it over to you so you can talk a little bit about what you do, what you specialize in, and who you work with. And obviously, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. So I run Oregon Autism Evaluations, a private practice located in Lake Oswego, Oregon, that focuses on the psychological evaluation and then neuroaffirming therapeutic support of those on the autism spectrum, working primarily with older children, adolescents, young adults, but also adults all through the lifespan. And so split time between providing therapy as well as diagnostic testing.
That's great. And I actually just want to dive right in and ask you to define a term, neuroaffirming. What does that mean to you, and how does it apply to the work that you are doing with your clientele?
Neuroaffirming is an approach where instead of trying to take an individual and make them match the world around them, but we focus on how they can best fit within the world as themselves. So one of the major problems that has been occurring with autism treatment, specifically when we were trying to even treat autism as a disorder, now I would say we don't treat autism, I treat people with autism for their psychological distress, but it's to, instead of taking away the elements that make themselves them, but focus in on making sure their strengths are allowing them to succeed. Now, I think a general example of that would be we used to really dissuade autistic individuals from engaging in any self-stimulatory behavior, what might be called stimming, or is really called stimming. And instead of telling kids or using behavioral restriction to try and get kids to not flap or not engage or not rock in their seats, which is a very self-soothing behavior, now we don't focus on that. It's not about normalizing. It's about finding a way to help a person be successful and not try and manipulate the way their brain is set up and force them. We're not trying to make the square peg go in the round hole anymore.
That is such it's a completely different paradigm. When I first started in mental health 30 years ago or whatever, it was with people with developmental disabilities and some people on the spectrum. And there was a lot of effort put into trying to shape them into what we expect them to be. And I'm wondering how this orientation to working with people with autism affects them and their view of themselves.
I think it affects them in allowing them to not think they're the problem. So schools are an easy example to use, even though it's not something that most of us are in anymore. But in a school environment, say, they need a movement break. The individual needs a movement break. We can educate the teacher that the kid needs the movement break and let them take a break from the classroom, right? Rather than trying to get the kiddo to conform to the teacher's expectation, which is the expectation for all 30 kids, regardless of what their actual need is. Mm-hmm. So it's more about educating the people around them to allow for the person to be more themselves. And then they don't go around viewing that they're the problem, mm-hmm. which is an incredibly more satisfying position to exist within than always feeling like you're the one out of place or you're the one that needs to change for everybody else's benefit.
I can imagine that softens relationships too between educators, parents, caregivers, family members, and the person who is being served and supported.
Exactly. And a lot of what it does is it takes away the perception of intent from the individual. And this is one also I see a lot in colleges, where professors at times can take things personally that had no intent. So if the individual is blunt, or they're a little too black and white in their thinking, or they're not using common societally expected nonverbal communication, the professor might take that as either a disrespectful sign or a sign that the student actually doesn't care about the material or the class or even being a college student at all, when that had nothing to do with what the student was actually conveying. They were not thinking about communicating in that way because that's not the way they communicate. So by changing the way others around them understand communication and broadening our understanding beyond just the neurotypical and to include all those others, then it really does feel like they're finding more of a place for themselves.
Wow, that's beautiful. I already have so many things I want to talk to you about and ask, but I am going to just go back to basics for a moment. Can you talk about what autism is and how it is typically understood in clinical and non-clinical political or social contexts.
Absolutely. So autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, still being called a disorder, and I think there's some controversy of whether it's a disorder or not, but from a mental health standpoint and from a diagnostic standpoint, we still do operate from a deficit model. But we know that it's within the brain and operates within the neurological systems, and it's a condition that primarily affects two different domains. It has a social element and as well as a restricted and repetitive pattern of behaviors, activities, and interests. So individuals with autism are going to have more challenges with their social communication, specifically nonverbal communication as well, both receptive in their ability to understand what others are communicating to them through nonverbal, as well as their expressive. They might use less nonverbal communication as a way of conveying what they mean to other people. And then also there's struggles with both the development and maintenance of relationship. And these, well, all of those three elements are required to be present for an autism diagnosis. How they look for every individual is going to be different, and the varying degrees of challenge that come from those will also be different.
And there is this component of, I mean, within the paradigm of a deficit approach to autism and a lot of other conditions that maybe are just about how we show up in the world. We could think of it that way. But I'm wondering if under that umbrella of a deficit model, if we look at distress in people with autism or who are on the spectrum somehow, if distress primarily, well, my question basically is about the influence of the context on generating distress within the individual, and how can the context change to soften it? Because, you know, like, I'm having a hard time getting to my question. Sorry, Michael. Sorry for later. But my question basically is, how much, and I know it's a spectrum disorder, so this isn't going to be easy to answer, but like, how much does the context cause distress, and how much would you say is generated within the individual? And then finally, how can we, as the context, influence or soften discomfort for people with autism?
I think a lot of that is going to depend on the specific distress that's being caused. And it's also going to vary depending on whether we're looking at the social difficulties or the restrictive repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, and activities. Because, for example, individuals with autism really do struggle with disruptions to their normal routine or any change to an expectation. So if the plan was to leave at 6 and now we're leaving at 6:30, that can result in a lot of distress. However, that's not really something that we can change because the world is full of unpredictability. So there's areas where we work more with the individual to adapt to the things that we don't have an influence on, that we don't want to become so rigid and controlling over our environment as a way of trying to prevent the anxiety from happening, because if we go for perfection, we're going to fall short, and then that little bit that we've fallen short becomes the focus of the distress rather than the 93% that we're actually doing very well at. So some of it is finding ways to build up supports and distress tolerance within the individual for some things that are just part of the way the world is going to operate. And by that, I don't mean the societal expectations, because that is where there can be certainly distress coming from the context. So if a person is, well, there was a way of putting it, if we drop a person on a desert island and they're all alone, do they have any conditions? Probably not. What does autism look like if you're all alone on the island? Well, you're going to be lonely, because individuals with autism do strive for and desire interpersonal relationships. It's a misnomer that those with autism don't want that type of connection. So aside from that, there are no social deficits because there are no social expectations. So the societal expectations in turn create a lot of that distress. So if we can change what is seen as acceptable social communication within the workplace climate or within a school, then by broadening what is considered acceptable, the person is now within the norm and not outside of it. So if we accept that we don't have to make eye contact, and the eye contact's not expected, then the person who really struggles with making eye contact and has to force themselves to make eye contact, now at the deficit of even being able to listen to the person they're talking to because they're so focused on trying to meet the societal expectation, they're actually able to show up in the world and actually experience it rather than trying to conform to what wasn't meant for them.
Yeah. I'm also thinking then about other components of being neurodivergent in a variety of ways, one of which is sensory integration challenges and, transition from A to B, and as you mentioned, changes in schedule or routine, etc. And these are things that people with autism often struggle with. But at the same time, I guess move backwards a little bit, I heard a story a long time ago about adaptations for people with any kind of disability, for lack of a better term. And the person who was talking was saying that if we just set the world up to be adaptable to everyone, then the world would be so much easier for all of us. And so I think about sensory issues, for example, and all of the noises in the world. If we could soften the sound around us, how much kinder would the world be to all of our ears, for example. But I don't know if that's an assumption I should be making as someone who is not on the spectrum or whatever, but I do wonder what the world would be like for all of us if we adapted. And you don't need to comment if you don't want to, because I know I just got on my own soapbox, but I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Well, I think you raise a very interesting point, too. And as a non-autistic person myself, I think it's important that I'm not here to speak for every member of that community or even any individual of that community. Just my clinical experience working with, supporting, but also my own social relationships with autistic individuals or family relationships with those autistic individuals and sharing the world with them. But there's a point where we can really do better in meeting each other in the middle and finding ways, because, sound is a great one. We can't control sound very well. Even every time I set a pen down, and I studied feelings for 10 years through graduate school and undergrad, so physics was not my strong suit, but every time I set the pen down, part of me still wonders, that made a noise. That little action made a noise. And there's millions and billions of little actions all the time making a noise. And if we can do a little bit better to bring down the environmental noise that we can and better create adaptive technology for individuals, noise canceling headphones, the over-ear, in-ear, all of these different technologies that continue to progress, and then making those socially acceptable to have in different environments. I am shocked how many times I have to write an accommodation to allow someone to wear headphones in the workplace, because that's seen as disrespectful. It's seen as a person's not working, even if they're not listening to anything. But that adaptation, which makes a previously inaccessible environment welcoming, gets resistance because it's not seen as, quote unquote, the way it's supposed to be.
Can you explain common profiles or characteristics of individuals who were not identified as autistic during childhood, but were diagnosed later in life?
Absolutely. So a lot of what happens, or has happened recently, is we've had a stereotypical model of what autism looks like. And I very specifically am using the word stereotypical because it's what we think of as autism, but it is not the entirety of the spectrum. And this is not even looking just at support needs, from high support needs individuals to low support needs individuals. What we might have used to call high functioning versus low functioning, but is moving away from that language to higher support needs and lower support needs. But we have a traditional example of what autism was supposed to be. It was also called the male presentation. It was the classic, Hans Asperger's and Leo Kanner out of the 1940s and 50s. That was the idea. The more severely impacted, the very behaviorally stimming, there might be more intellectual issues going on, but it's what we would think of as that person is clearly having a great deal of difficulty navigating the world around them. And the communication also was very visibly disconnected from their own experience. They might not have any verbal communication, or they might have limited or restricted communication. So much so that I was speaking to an educator once who worked in the 60s who asked me if individuals with autism could talk. And that was the experience she had been working with in the 1960s. So the understanding that we have this full, broad spectrum has been relatively recent, but now we're also getting a better understanding that there is more than that stereotypical presentation, and that there are many people who are themselves autistic that we would not observe from the outside because of either societal expectations that have changed the way they're going to present themselves, or from intentional masking and camouflaging, either hiding what they would consider to be the unusual but more specifically autistic features, or generating what they would see as a more neurotypical presentation. And this is also the other presentation would then sometimes be called female presentation or presenting autism, but that also doesn't really, it's not fair to call it that because cisgender males can have that presentation. Cisgender females can have the more stereotypical presentation. Non-binary individuals and transgender individuals can have either presentation too. So there are some lines where it might fall, and this is a very long build-up to getting to what that actual presentation is, which is one where, for a classic example, what we expect from boys and girls is just different. And it's usually giving, not in every case, but usually giving boys much more benefit of the doubt when it comes to behavioral issues in the classroom as we're trying to develop or identify what would be autistic. And so with boys, the hyper-focused interests or the specialized interests are often seen as more societally unaccepted. So if you're really obsessed with garbage trucks or you're really obsessed with street signs or things along these lines, after a certain age it starts to look more atypical and we start to wonder, that's something might be going on there. But the amount of time that we would allow a little girl to be completely infatuated with princesses is going to go on and on and on. So what actually might be an autistic special interest is just pushed off as, well, that's just something girls do. That's just something they enjoy. And so it's just, as I said, cast aside. So there might be a history of those hyper-focuses, but they were more seen as, oh, isn't it cute that they like this thing so much? Or, oh, that's just always been their thing, but it's not seen as problematic or socially distancing or separating from their peers. The other is girls tend to have stronger friendships. Who are autistic females tend to have stronger friendships than autistic boys do when they're growing up. And we don't exactly know why all the times. And this is not to imply that they had strong friendships, but they might have had more. And some of that is that they're taught they have to. And that females are taught to be much more cognizant of social rules. And so that it does not get lost on autistic females who are growing up, so they might be faced with even more pressure to develop social masking and camouflaging to come off and present themselves in a neurotypical way through active application and planning and rehearsing and training themselves or observing others than the boys who are not given that added societal pressure, so they're able to get lost more and disregard those expectations to a more extreme when it's coming along with autism. So if we're looking at an adult who's looking back at their childhood, they're going to have a lot of rehearsing maybe. They're going to have a lot of practicing. There's going to be a very intentional process to get the friends they did have. And sometimes those friends can even be special interests. And that level of focus on the person, which then gets brushed aside by parents. And not to say this is a bad thing, but it gets brushed aside as the parents as, oh, they're just really into that new friend. But it's still, once again, a sign of special interest. So the features and symptoms are the same, but how they present and how they look to an outsider is very, very different.
You know, gender, you talked about it a lot, just in the way that we're speaking of autism spectrum, gender, it seems, is still a powerful influence on the things we admonish, the things we encourage, and also will affect what we see and what we don't see in terms of how we can support an individual who may need some extra support. So I just wanted to point that out, especially as we begin to expand our definition of gender, and I wonder how that is going to influence this population amongst others, you know?
Absolutely. I think what we're learning is we need to be listening to what's going on right now. If we focus on the research that's been done in the past, there's a lot of wonderful books that have been written over the last few decades on autism, but I almost don't recommend any that are older than 5 years old because there's going to be something in there that's out of date. And it could be out of date in a neutral way, or it could be out of date in a very problematic way that's giving a person bad information that is invalidating their experience. So finding and researching and using the individuals who are being identified now and better understanding their own experience with autism and what that feels like internally, rather than just trying to look at the external, but getting to the internal experience and how an autistic individual is navigating the world, will better inform the assessment measures that we can try and use in our evaluations. But that's one of the biases that we have in psychology to begin with, is many of the assessment measures that we currently have for autism are biased towards boys. We had more boys in the sample for the comparison group, for the diagnostic group, and even for some of the quote-unquote gold standards. When you start looking at actually what they used to validate their measure, we could be looking at samples that are as low as 20 females, and they're using that as a generalizable sample.
Which, unfortunately, it's not unique to this population in terms of excluding biological females in research. Continues to be an issue.
Absolutely not. It is I often will put it as psychology has a lot of black eyes in our history, and we're continuously trying to make amends for the things we've done and to do better. And some of that has to be listening to the people who have the conditions and not just focusing on it from that top down, oh, we're the experts, so we must know everything. Of course we don't. We're not the people living with the experience. They're the ones who have the information that we need to better be able to support the population.
Which is part of the entire purpose of this podcast, is to understand people from the inside out and their experience. And, hopefully we bring experts in like yourself who can give voice to those who haven't had the opportunity to speak on behalf of themselves. So I just wanted to say that. But also, I'm curious about your perspective on, there's been some controversy around dropping the Asperger's, that specific. You want to talk about that or not?
I will certainly talk about that, because, it's the first thing I'll say.
Maybe for our audience, if you don't mind, can you talk about it from your perspective about what happened with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, autism spectrum disorder is a relatively new diagnosis in its singularity. It came about in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, in about 2013, is when we combined the previously what would have been considered the autism spectrum disorders, primarily being autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and then a pervasive developmental disorder, both of which were considered, but a pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, to capture individuals who clearly were on the spectrum somewhere but weren't meeting the full diagnostic criteria for either autistic disorder or Asperger's syndrome. When we went to DSM-5, the researchers putting together that manual, which is published by the American Psychiatric Association, so the medical wing, not the psychological association that I belong to, but it's the Psychiatric Association, they used their research and looking out to decide that there wasn't enough difference to keep those separated. There wasn't enough difference between autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome. And when you really looked at the diagnostic criteria side by side, a lot of it really just came down to, did you have a language acquisition delay? If you were delayed in learning to talk, you got an autism diagnosis. If you weren't delayed in speaking, you got an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis. And colloquially, the misunderstanding that came with that was autism was the low-functioning folks, Asperger's was the high-functioning folks. And we do know there is a higher incidence of intellectual disability for those with autism, but 44% of people with autism still have average or above average intelligence. So it's a complete misnomer that autism is directly connected to an intellectual disability. But that misnomer has continued on, and there was a lot of displeasure with the combination because people have become very attached to these identities that they had Asperger's. And there's some othering of, oh, I have this, they have that, we are separate. But I also don't want to invalidate a person's individual experience that really found meaning in their Asperger diagnosis. I don't think we're going to go back, even though internationally they still use Asperger's. It was only the United States that combined the diagnoses. But the more we learn about Dr. Asperger, the less positive things are coming out about his work. There's relatively new book within the last 5 years that covers his work in Austria in the early 1940s, and that his work with Nazi scientists was a little closer than might have been previously considered. And there's some controversies over how much saving he did of individuals. He very much was focused on the saving of individuals who he deemed to be positive to society, which were typically the Asperger identified individuals who were more higher functioning under that terminology. But there is some evidence to support that for individuals with high degrees of intellectual disability or more significant autistic features were in fact segregated out and possibly sent to some of the German camps.
Oh, gosh.
So I think that information has been quite distressing to a lot who have found a lot of identity with the Asperger label, and in many situations we're separating out the person from the life that continues on beyond their name. And in the end, people get to use whatever term they feel is most applicable. When I do an evaluation with someone, I explain these differences and explain how any diagnosis they'll be given would be autism spectrum disorder. But I'm not going to be out there telling them not to use Asperger's if that's what they felt to be more within their own personal experience, especially for those who were diagnosed with that as a kid. And now they're being reevaluated because they now need supports in a different arena. And those new diagnoses are going to be seen in autism spectrum disorder. And anyone with an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis was rolled over into the new diagnosis, even though we changed the diagnostic criteria as we've done that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, the impact of making a change like that, it may seem small, but obviously it's going to affect people day to day and the way they live their life if their supports are reliant on a particular diagnosis. So,
well, absolutely. And I think there's so many different opinions on the importance of the label. And for some people, the label means nothing. It's one piece of them. And for some people, it's a very important factor of their identity. And if it helps them make meaning and navigate the world, then why would we ever want to take that away from them? But then there's also the aspects of what does the science support in our diagnoses going forward. And you can even see that in literature. There's books published by the major publishing houses after 2013 that are still identifying Asperger's in the title. So I don't think Asperger's as a term is going to go away in any semblance of it's just not going to go away. But I think diagnostically, I would be very hard-pressed to see it integrated back in, especially with the more problematic histories that we're learning about someone who did some good work as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want you to tell me, if you don't mind, if I'm right or wrong, or maybe it's not black and white, but when I worked with people with autism for a long time, the way that I experienced a lot of my clients was as though they had a highly specialized mind. You know, that what it felt like to me was these are human beings that live in a world that's, as you've talked about, not necessarily very accommodating or understanding or whatever, but there were often, I can say, just like with anybody, everybody comes to the table with certain gifts. But it felt like many of my clients had not just gifts, but real gifts, that they were highly specialized a lot of the time, and their minds seemed to work well in compartments. They were compartmentalized in certain ways, or their gifts were compartmentalized. And I always thought that it was so interesting to learn what the gift was. I was just kind of waiting for the gift to show up, and there was always at least one. But I'm curious if that has any relevance, or if it's rooted in anything, or if that's just my experience, that there are specializations in some ways.
I think the way, sometimes people right now are referring to autism as a superpower. And I think a lot of those with autism don't necessarily like that terminology.
I can imagine, yeah.
And I would say that it's a bridge too far to really call the entire condition, because there are a lot of challenges, especially when we have 1 in 36 right now is our current rate for individuals with autism.
Well, that's a lot more than I would have thought.
That's our most up-to-date, and I believe in 1992 we were on 150, 1 in 150. So it certainly has increased, but we've changed the diagnostic criteria about 4 times in that period as well to refine what we understand. But the hyper focus, which is the way I say hyper focus a lot, and sometimes that's heard in a negative way. That's where I see it as a potential superpower.
Yes.
It's if you're able to channel your ability to focus for extended periods of time, where 7 hours doing the same thing vanishes in moments because have so much passion for it. If you can turn that into something productive, then it becomes a superpower. And it's not to say that we need it to be productive, but that's where that individual can be especially lucky. And I've worked with plenty of software engineers who fit this bill, or engineers in general who would fit this bill, because it allows them to focus on that one problem that happens to be exactly what tickles their brain in just the right way to make them super focused and super interested on it, and that focus never lags. Sometimes it's not going to latch onto something that's quote-unquote productive, and then it almost can feel more limiting. If there's a Scottish comedian, Fern Brady, who is diagnosed as autistic as an adult, and she's particularly pushed back on this idea of it being a superpower, using the example of, well, if it's a superpower to drone on and on about Sylvia Plath with zero social recognition, if the other person is interested or not, then I've got a superpower. So in some ways, it is incredibly challenging to have that hyper focus. But if you're able to transition it into something that you can use to your benefit, then you've got a way to make it beneficial. But you do not need to have a special superpower to have value as a human being.
Absolutely not.
And I think that sometimes parents, especially when there's a new diagnosis, can latch on to this savant idea that not even just because every one of us has something we're probably really, really good at. And who knows what that thing's going to be, and we're going to find it. But to get to that stereotypical savant level, what we saw in Rain Man, what we have seen in real life, there's an example of a man who can fly over a city one time, draw the whole thing perfectly. It's remarkable. That doesn't give him any more value than the high support need individual who didn't develop verbal language. But finding the way that they can use the skills that they have, especially their ability to really dig deep, then we are able to find and access that special gift.
Well, what I'm really appreciative of, and I mean, I appreciate a lot of things that you just said, but assigning value to certain ways that people show up in the room or certain gifts they may bring to the table is really not fair or kind, and doesn't feel good, even if you're somebody who comes to the table with a gift that society would generally deem valuable.
I look at that more as luck. They were lucky that their special interests happened to line up in something that society wanted from them. Mm-hmm. And in a way, society can exploit that from them. But if your special interest is Sylvia Plath, and unless you're going to become a professor that specializes in it, enjoy it, love it. Embrace that passion, feed that passion. Just because you can't sell it or market it, it doesn't in any way take away the joy that's bringing to you in the first place.
Well, and perhaps that's true for all of us, that what brings us joy is not something we sell.
That's what my parents would say about my collection of books on Disneyland.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, I love Disneyland too. So I do have another question for you. I have another question for you around sort of overlap of populations. And again, this is anecdotal for me. I'm not up to date on the research, admittedly, but I have a specialization in working with people with dissociative disorders. Several of my clients over the past 20 years are also transgendered, and several of them also have been diagnosed with as being on the spectrum. Are there either in those categories, diagnostic categories, or others, are there areas of overlap that you're seeing in your population?
I think some of the challenges, there's the overlaps we see. We do have a higher incidence of individuals who are transgender who also are autistic, and we don't exactly know why. One of the theories that seems to hold a lot of weight in my mind is individuals with autism are less concerned with societal expectations to begin with, so letting go of that expectation to live their lives as a false or cisgender self isn't as much of a hurdle for them, or they've already experienced so much social rejection that living their authentic life is already more there's more benefit in that because they're not feeling like they're losing as much potentially from the social. So there's elements of not exactly knowing why that presentation might be higher. But then there's also the reasons we have overlap because the diagnostic criteria have a lot of similarities. So ADHD is a big example of this. Before DSM-5, you could not diagnose ADHD and autism in the same person. They were considered too similar to be diagnostically established in the same individual. Now we've changed that. We can see that there are individuals with autism who can also have attention difficulties and executive functioning challenges that go above and beyond what we would expect from an individual with autism. But ADHD is not really a deficit of attention deficit. It is a diagnosis that focuses on attention regulation challenges. The hyper-focus and special interests of a person with ADHD, in my experience, looks almost identical, if not identical, to that for an individual with autism. The ability to get incredibly super-focused on an area of interest and stay with it for a long period of time, and individuals with ADHD can do that almost exactly the same as an individual with autism, which is a big thing that will draw people into a diagnostic evaluation that could actually in turn be a diagnosis of ADHD instead of autism, because that was the primary feature they were identifying with. But they also could have both. The other big overlap, and I think this one is less about the way we've written the diagnostic criteria and the experience, but more the experience that a person has going through the world, is specifically social anxiety disorder. I would say, with the rare exception of individuals who have a real block to the societal expectations, that they're living in their own world to the degree that they don't perceive the rejections, which in some ways sounds like a paradise and in other ways sounds like a prison to me, where you don't notice that other people are rejecting you, but you also don't notice other people are rejecting you. But aside from this small kind of group of individuals, there is anxiety. There is anxiety in social situations for almost every person that I see with autism. Of course, I'm seeing a clinical population, and we're focusing on that in therapy. But if you don't fully trust your abilities to engage with people, and if you have a lower capacity for perceiving nonverbal communications, you're going to have anxiety that you're reading it right. And so an individual can have diagnosed social anxiety disorder, capital letters, or they can have social anxiety that's stemming from the fact that these social experiences are something that their brain is not wired to engage with as effectively as a neurotypical individual. And because they're going into it with less ability and maybe less knowledge and less natural perception of it, that in and of itself is going to generate anxiety. So the most common things that I'm seeing overlap are, we do have the higher incidence of individuals who are transgender. We have the overlap with ADHD, and then the extreme overlap, I would say, with experiences of, whether we're calling it a disorder or not, anxiety in social situations.
Yeah, and then, which leads me to my next question around trauma. Obviously that's something that I'm passionate about, and I'm wondering how folks who have had to navigate a world that is sometimes unfriendly to them, how that affects their perception of themselves, other in the world, and are you seeing higher rates of PTSD in this population as a result of some of the things that they're coming to the table with?
I think there's a challenge in, one, I think our diagnostic labels for trauma are lacking in we don't have enough ways to really convey the intricacies of how trauma are experienced by people, especially as for my diagnostic evaluations, I talk to people in that I really focus only on what's within the DSM. Not because what's within the DSM is the only thing that exists, but because in my experience, if you take this document and try and use it as documentation of disability, if there's things that are not in the DSM, those can be used against you and prevent you from getting services. So complex PTSD is something that kind of lives outside of that right now. And I think that it serves a big purpose, but I'm not bringing it into the diagnosis just to make sure we're protecting the individual and not giving any ammunition from an organization that does not want to be supportive or provide accommodations. But there is this experience of, if you grow up and are constantly engaged with the world around you and feeling like you just don't fit and you just don't know what to do, and no matter your best efforts, every time you try, it fails. Your relationships fail, your friendships fail, You have all of these experiences where you think something should have gone better, but you don't exactly know why, or something completely blew up and you don't know why. If you're undiagnosed, the only variable left there is you. And it's ingrained that you're the problem, you're at fault, you're not good enough, you're broken, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I think one of the most rewarding parts of the work that I do is by providing that diagnosis and giving the context to those past experiences, we can start to develop self-compassion and undo some of the impact of that trauma, to really see that the reason adolescence went so poorly for you was not because you were broken, but it was probably the most narrowed your world was ever going to be. You had to go to school. You had to go to a school that is at best designed for half of the kids there. But if it's a school without resources or required to follow state mandates or has staffing shortages, it's really not going to be a positive environment. And it's not going to be able to provide the support that you need. But once you get into the world, so that is the trauma they're taking with them. That's the part that we have to undo, because once we're an adult, we got to shape the world a lot more. The idea of going back to middle school and sitting for 8 hours a day and having to be told what to learn for an hour.
No, thanks.
Horrible. That sounds horrible. And even the older I get, the less I even know if I could make myself do it the way I had to do it all through middle school, all through high school, where there was so little variability. We get a little better in college, we get a little better in grad school, but it takes a long time, and it's years and years of just being beaten down until you realize that, oh, you were being beaten down because you were in an environment that in no way was set up for you to be successful. It's essentially the idea that if you pushed me out on a basketball court and said the only way that you have value is if you can dunk, I am 5'9" on a good day. I am not going to be able to dunk that basketball ever. So, and by those terms, I will never have value, because I'm never going to be able to achieve what they've set as the standard for success. And so if we change what the standard for success is, which happens naturally as we age, but also change the expectations in our own mind of what it means to have a social life that is rewarding. If you have 2 friends and your social needs are met, great. You don't need to have 5. You need to have what you need, not what anyone else is telling you you need. And through childhood and adolescence, everybody's telling you what you need. So we have to undo that to set them up, and then they can be successful more in adulthood, where they actually have that control that was entirely lacking before.
Yeah, and then you spoke earlier of this I wanted to just bring it back into the conversation a little bit in this context of, trying to fit within a world that operates in a different way or through a different lens or whatever, that there is this other weight that is carried, and that is the idea of masking, pretending, trying to mimic, to belong, etc. And even just the act of that is so fatiguing. Like, we can all relate to it, that if, we feel upset one day and we have to put on a face and pretend that we're not, or, we're tired and we have to do a podcast. I'm enjoying the podcast, actually. But, if we have to pretend, it's very tiring. And then that chips away at our ability to put our energy in areas where we can promote success for ourselves and others. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that, because that's a theme that I hear in all of our clients. And it seems to be a normal weight if it's one that we have to carry.
Absolutely. And it's something we all mask to some degree. We all present the version of ourselves that's most appropriate for this setting. Of course, I am not talking to you right now the same way I talk to my mom, or the same way I talk to my best friend. They're all versions of me, and I still feel like an authentic version of myself, but it's not the same presentation. I'm thinking of different things. I'm using different words. I'm conveying myself in a specific way for the setting, and that is more draining. It is more exhausting to present different versions, and the further away from that authentic self, the more draining it can be. And that's a reality we really can't fully avoid. And I think getting away from the idea that you need to be your perfectly authentic self in every second is going to be very much the salmon swimming upstream in trying to navigate the world. But you do not need to be held to the expectation that that version of you that's the most away, but the one that might be expected in certain situations, is the version you need to present to everyone. So the way I would give it to my clients is, okay, we're going to mask in that job interview. because they need to see what they need to see. We're going to fake the eye contact, not because eye contact is the right thing to do, but because eye contact is a nonverbal communication of respect. And you are conveying respect, but we're going to add nonverbal communication on top of that, so the other person now has two modes of receiving the respect. We've got the nonverbal and the verbal, the thank you for that interview, all of those things that come along with it. Then when you're at the job, once you're not tricking them, you're giving them what they need to see so they don't give you doubts that are unfair. You start to bring in your real self. It's the same thing in social situations and potentially even romantic situations of if you need to present yourself in a way to get over the hurdle of meeting the person so then you can be your real self, that might be worth the challenge. But if you have to be that person after the hurdle, then you're not in the right situation, or that's not the right person for you, because now they're not actually accepting you for being your authentic self. So the people that mean the most to you should be able to have you in all forms and understand that if you need to unmask, it's not because you care any less about each other. It's because there's only so much energy you can put into that. An hour of presenting podcast self is more tiring than an hour of presenting social self, which is more tiring than presenting alone time. Or it's going to be variable for different individuals as well. So finding the way that works for you, but also doesn't get in the way of getting what you want. If you really want that job and you know you're going to be successful at it, fake it in the interview, mask when you need to, and then bring the real self in once they're actually ready to meet the real you.
Well, I love the pragmatism in that approach, that we do have to fit in a world and we do all have to mask, so it normalizes that experience as well.
So one thing that I really want to have a chance to talk about, because it's a point that when I'm doing an evaluation for an individual of any age, I've heard it at individuals 40, 50, and 60, is how their social lives just crashed when they entered middle school or went into sixth grade. And a lot of that came down to nothing about them changed, but all of the expectations of what meant to be engaged in play changed. So in elementary school, we have tag. We have the monkey bars. We have imaginative play that has rules. You are told explicitly what you need to do to engage in this game. Tag is a very simple game to follow. So the play is based on these structured activities. When we get into middle school, the play is replaced with social play. It's replaced with conversations at lunch, not running around on the playground. And there are no rules. There are really no rules for middle school social. And if there are, they are rough. But so instead of getting to go around and follow highly structured play rules, you now have to navigate excessive amounts of social communication, and we get to add dating into it. And so now we have not just the development of friendships, we have the development of romantic relationships and romantic interests and the middle school version of romantic interests, who's seeing who's holding whose hand, what qualifies as a relationship. All of that is just thrown at them in the face like a snowball fart they weren't ready for. And so they feel this big downturn, and that's also the time where their identity is really starting to develop. So we're integrating into their identity that you have no idea what's going on, you have no idea how to prepare for any of this, and every time you try something, there is a gaggle of people there just ready to criticize and make fun of you for it. So that's another common experience that those who reach adulthood without a diagnosis have, is that real plummeting of their social life and friendships entering middle school, not because anything necessarily about them changed, but we just went ahead and changed all the rules on them.
And they're ambiguous at best.
And they are incredibly ambiguous at best, and everyone's fighting to try and build their own identity, and they're just little balls of insecurity to begin with. I would much rather go back and sit in those classrooms than trying to sit in the lunchroom in a middle school, because the idea of trying to navigate what is cool, what is in, what is out, who can you trust, who can you not trust, who's going to turn on you. The instance I remember coming into 8th grade, I had the best friend over the summer. All of a sudden he starts treating me like dirt. I have no idea why. Oh, I wasn't cool enough for the other kids. So they changed all those rules on me. It worked out. I'm okay now. But I just remember that experience of not having any idea of why did we go to hanging out over the summer and now he's stepping on my pillow at the school sleepover to look cool to the other kids. None of that made any sense. And that's one experience that I can draw from. As a non-autistic person, I can only imagine how many of those instances that make just as little sense to them build and build and build, and it becomes a death from 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah. And then there is this extra layer of sexuality coming into play. Would you say that there are a few questions. One, social misconceptions about people with autism and sexuality. That's my first part.
Well, I can say that individuals with autism are as sexual as non-autistic individuals.
Yeah, why wouldn't they be?
And I think it's going to vary depending on support needs, because like a lot of the individuals I work with now, especially those who make it to adulthood without being diagnosed, are generally and almost exclusively going to be lower support needs individuals, which I want to stress is also can be an invalidating term. Lower support needs is not to say you're not struggling or have supports. It's in comparison to the autism spectrum. How many supports do you specifically need from autism? And it is a very broad spectrum and covers individuals who need constant one-on-one or even two-on-one support in school to those who are graduating from any higher education degree across the country and holding highly successful jobs. So there's a huge spectrum of support needs. But in the lower support needs who make it to adulthood, I'm not blanking.
Well, we're talking about sex.
We are talking about sex. I should be very comfortable talking about sex. It was my doctoral thesis, was focusing on the fact that for higher support needs individuals, we infantilize them. We completely ignore that sexuality development. And because it's so uncomfortable to talk about, we keep deferring, punting the ball down the field instead of actually addressing it. So in those instances, now we can have individuals who are masturbating in entirely unhealthy ways because no one had the conversation with them. Not just in inappropriate places and inappropriate times, but in inappropriate ways that are no longer safe because no one sat down and had a conversation and explained, oh, this is a better way to do it. This is the way to healthily do it. And there's nothing wrong with it. There's something wrong with it with doing it in McDonald's, but there's nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong about doing it in your bedroom with the door closed and the window blinds closed. So for higher support individuals, there's the risk of infantilizing them and ignoring the sexual element. For lower support needs individuals, there can be a risk of being told what is appropriate sexual behavior in a manipulative way, in saying, oh, you care about me. It's whatever the genders of the relationship, oh, you care about me. Well, people who care about each other perform this particular sex act on each other. And if you care about me, you would perform it and kind of like, well, I care about people and I don't really understand social rules and I don't really understand what I'm supposed to be doing. They're now getting talked into doing something that they're really not comfortable about, but they think is the thing they're supposed to do because that's what this person said society says they're supposed to do. So it really increases the importance of education and access to support of what is, and boundaries and consent and all the stuff that's good for all average. Well, every adolescent needs this stuff, but it's incredibly and even more important for those who are autistic who might struggle with the cues or even suppress their own discomfort because of a desire to be in the liked group. But I think those rules are so incredibly vague and boundaries are not really respected in adolescence. I think it's always a push, push, push. And I'm speaking that more from my understanding of seeing it as an adolescent. And I know there's been lots of changes over the last few decades as we've moved to more affirmative consent models. Not no means no, but yes means yes. I think that's an excellent place that we should be at, and to making sure that it's not about a person doesn't just have to not say no, but the person needs to have said yes to what we're engaging in, as well as the ability to say stop at any given time. But what we see is individuals who are autistic are people, first and foremost. And while we might have differences in experiences and ways of going about the world, I would think of it as having similar differences to an American going to Australia. There's going to be customs we don't understand, but with proper education, we're going to get up to speed and figure it out. and be able to navigate it okay. But part of it is going in knowing, oh, I'm different than all of this, but that's also okay. This wasn't meant for me. I didn't grow up here. The same way an autistic person didn't grow up in an autistic world. They grew up in a holistic world, which is not really taking their needs into account.